choices shape the market, our society, and our quality of life. That's why Euroconsumers helps millions of people in their daily choices, providing simple solutions to complex problems. Euroconsumers is a cluster of organizations, a network of people, a group established to protect consumer rights and well-being that brings consumers and companies together in transparent relationships of trust that respect their independence. Our deep understanding of products and consumption gives consumers a credible, expert voice worldwide. We bridge the gap between buyers and manufacturers, between supply and demand. And in this digital age, we create opportunities for all parties to come together in constructive dialogue, partnering to build a future of better products and services. Euroconsumers has the power of a global group that believes humanity can develop, grow, and change for the better, and that we can promote this by uniting millions of consumers in strength and speaking responsibly for them, while simultaneously engaging in relationships of trust with responsible, sustainable companies.
Good afternoon and welcome everybody to the 5th edition of Start Talking, where we will be talking today about the disinformation overload and how we might protect people from harmful messages and fake news online. A new, stronger code of practice on disinformation has just been published by the European Commission, and this has been designed to mitigate some of the worst effects of disinformation online. It covers things like monetization through advertising, external access to data about how information flows, and also skilling up users to spot some of the fake news or misleading information. And what's really important about the code is that when the Digital Services Act comes into force, and those of you following European policy will know that that's one of the package of large EU regulations which are coming through. When the DSA comes into force, the code will actually be referred to as a code of conduct. So this means that the so-called very large online platforms, if they adhere to the code and can demonstrate that they're following it, then that will be able to demonstrate that they're addressing the systemic risks of disinformation. So the code has some regulatory legs as well. It's more than just a voluntary code of practice. And so far, 34 signatories have committed to the code, which is a lot more than the original one in 2018. We'll be asking in the next hour whether that's enough to stem the flow of harmful information out there or whether more needs to be done. So we have a great panel with us today, really fantastic people who know the code inside out and who know about the harmful effects of disinformation in advertising from a first-hand perspective. So I'm going to start now by introducing you to all of them. So our first guest today is Oreste Pollicino. He's a professor of constitutional law at the University of Bocconi, and he also directs the LLM in the Law of Internet Technology program. He's fulfilled lots of international and European level roles, including being a member of the Council of Europe Ad Hoc Committee on AI and the Italian representative to the OECD Committee, the Global Partnership on AI. But for the particular interest of today, we're going to find out more about his role in developing this new strengthened code of conduct, where he was the honest broker between all of those different stakeholders. So he'll be describing a little bit more about that when we come to him later. Our second guest today is Lara Levitt. She's a public policy manager at Meta's EU Affairs team, and she's worked closely with Oreste on the code and works in the area of content regulation and the protection of democracy and where those two might intersect. So a very tricky intersection there. She's represented Meta in the development of the code, and prior to working there, she was an EU competition lawyer and worked out of Brussels and London. So welcome, Lara. Thank you for being here. And our third panelist is Harriet Kingerby. She is the co-chair of the Conscious Advertising Network, which she co-founded in 2018. This is a network of ad ecosystem actors and organizations, and within 4 years it's grown to 150 members, and they're working to make advertising more ethical and to respect consumers and transform the ecosystem. The members now range from people like O2 to Accenture and other brands. So she's also worked with consumer groups across the world as part of her fellowship with the Mozilla Foundation, where she looked at the risks of online advertising in the future. And finally, as if that wasn't enough, she also works at the Creative and Media Agency, Media Bounty, who work with a lot of brands on green products and services, and also do data analysis and info gathering on climate misinformation. So some really excellent perspectives that Harriet's going to be able to bring today. So welcome everybody. We're really delighted you've been able to come together today, just before you go off on all your holidays and we break for the summer. So we're going to get the discussion started. So Oreste, I'm going to turn to you first. If you could tell us a bit about the development of the new code, something about its history and how you think it's different to the previous code in 2018.
Thank you very much, Elliot, first of all, and congratulations for this initiative. I think it's very important to have a public debate on such issues, to have a pluralistic debate, because the topic is clearly very hot, but it's very important to go beyond the labels. For example, in this case, what I will try to do is to go beyond the idea of a code that for sure it's much stronger than the previous one. What I would like to share with you is a few ideas, a few, let's say, speculation about which I think has been the engine that in a way brought to this kind of change, acceleration, improvement, call as you want. So let's put the clock back of 5 years. Basically 4. It was 2018, and as you know very well, there was the first strategy of the European Commission against disinformation. In that case, I was part of the high-level expert group that tried to advise the European Commission, but there was a problem there. The problem was basically that there was not, and I'm not sure that it's still now, but for sure at that time there was not a legal basis related to something that could have been done more than self-regulation. In order to be clear, there was not at all something called the SA at the horizon. So basically, what the Commission did, and I think didn't have so many options, was basically counting and proposing an exercise of self-regulation. So let's try to be clear. The code of 2018, in terms of methodology, is a great innovative model because it's the first, globally speaking, multi-stakeholder forum on a voluntary basis related to a topic so important. It's not clearly new, but is amplified by the digital context. So in terms of methodology, it was still a great innovative model. In terms of content, we should be clear, it was a little bit disappointing. Why? Because first of all, there was only a major part represented, the main platforms. And this is the main difference with the new or strengthened one that represents many voices, sometimes conflicting voices in society. Clearly the platforms, the industry, but also civil society, fact checker, advertising company, just to name few. So this is the first important difference. Variety means interaction. It means trying to find a consensus starting from different perspectives. It's an exercise, it's not democracy for sure, of pluralism and I would say dialogue. And the dialogic perspective was very important. Second main difference, the code of 2018 was lacking of precisions in terms of in terms of measures, in terms of commitment, especially. So basically, it was a very interesting declaration of intent, but you know very well that in order to make a code of practice, a real code of practice, what is important is to have precise commitment, to have precise measures, and especially to have precise KPIs, indicators that should in a way verify which are the efforts and how it's possible to measure the effort. So this was basically what it was missing, and this is what I think is now in the new code. And as I said, that I don't want to steal time. Was a very important exercise that, as you can imagine, and this is the last ingredient, was in a way possible in the light of the guidelines of European Commission adopted in 2021. Because as you can imagine, such guidelines in theory were basically soft law, but de facto became, I think I can say this among us, the red line that basically was not possible to go below. So in a way, we had the kind of red line, and we knew that it was impossible to go below. This helped a lot. So all these ingredients clearly. The horizon of the co-regulation made, I think, the process much more smoothly, and then we can comment later. But I think the results are very promising. It's a starting point, but it's a very good starting point.
Thanks, Oreste. So we've got more stakeholders, we've got a clearer legal basis, and we also have some red lines that are set out. So we feel like there's a sense that we know what we're dealing with. Just to follow up on that, and this is more for maybe people who are less familiar with the issue. Can you tell us a bit more about the terminology that we use? So we have disinformation, misinformation, fake news, junk news.
Yeah.
Do we all understand the difference? As a regular consumer, what do I know?
Thank you very much for this question, because it allows me, first of all, to do again a step back and to try to focus on the definition of the European Commission in the first strategy 2018. Basically, I mean, there is now, I am clearly provoking. There is a constitutional right to say a lie. This is not an issue. What is an issue from a constitutional dimension is when disinformation, first of all, has produce harms, produce tangible and, I would say, delicate harms to a ultra-individual dimension. This is the first. The second is the intention. When we speak about disinformation, the intention to harm. And then clearly there is also the third element to have a profit. The profit can be very, very large, understood. It's not only economic profit. A profit might be also to have as a result of the election candidate X and not candidate Y as a winner. So this is disinformation. Then fake news is not anymore in the book, in our dictionary, thanks God. Fake news is just used by journalists, but it's not anymore a term that it's used into the work because it's misleading. It doesn't mean basically anything. So disinformation gives the idea of the intention. Misinformation are the misleading information that might not be intentional one, but at the end of the day, they produce in any case harms. So what is important here, and I mean, Lara, that was as a competition lawyer, as a background, knows very well this, is the effect theory. So sometimes it doesn't matter the intention, but if the effect is going to produce harm, even misinformation should be taken into account. Otherwise, the risk is to focus only on the professional disinformation, but you know very well that there is also the risk of not intentional misinformation that might be very, very problematic in polluting the public debate.
Thank you. That's really clear. That's really helpful. I'm going to ask Harriet now. Oreste then mentioned information that produces a harm. So can you tell us a bit about your experience with the conscious advertising network and the harms that you've seen, and also who's creating this? How many people are out there making this, and what impact is it having?
Yeah, absolutely. So you might be asking, why is an advertiser here talking about misinformation? And you'd be absolutely right to. What we need to know is that advertising is the funding model that underpins the creation of disinformation and the proliferation of misinformation. So, for example, if you are going to create kind of salacious content, if you're going to, I don't know, for example, either kind of broadcasters in some senses, political actors in others, and that salacious content has advertising next to it, then it's quite easy for you to earn really good money. Advertising also props up the outlets and the platforms, kind of in which misinformation, disinformation proliferates. So actually attacking that business model and getting advertisers to get better at understanding what mis and disinformation are and the actions they can take is a really important part of tackling this problem. And the harms that dis and misinformation cause are profound. We saw this during COVID, where actually people were, I think, believing medical misinformation and causing harms to themselves. We see it in a commercial sense. So one of our members is, a telecoms company. During COVID, again, people that believed that COVID was linked to 5G were destroying their infrastructure and threatening their engineers. And in a wider sense, we've seen the impact kind of disinformation can have on democracy with the insurrection in the USA. So the harms are profound, they're serious, and it's really something that we have to take incredibly seriously. So the work that we do is very much around educating advertisers, helping them to understand how they can better spend their media spend, and not only defund dis and misinformation, but also actually actively fund good journalism, factual content, the kind of stuff that, actually allows consumers to be informed and to make good decisions about the important issues of today. And we also work with the platforms. So we work with them to understand how they can, to help them understand these issues better, and, to essentially kind of to help them to do better. So one of our biggest, kind of achievements recently was to partner with Google on a climate misinformation policy that was centered around a super clear definition of climate misinformation that everyone can understand. And they then embedded that in their, kind of advertising policy. So you can now no longer monetize or kind of put ad spend behind kind of climate disinformation.
Thanks, Harriet. And again, we're coming back to terminology and definitions. I mean, you said that you're looking also towards, if I've understood correctly, you're looking also towards brands to fund good information, if you like. Is that problematic to have brands deciding what's good or bad, or are we clear enough on what dis and misinfo are that we can do that?
So absolutely, I think living in a world where advertisers dictate editorial policy is not somewhere we want to be, absolutely. And so, Oreste mentioned this idea of red lines and harm. And so that's what we work with organizations such as the UN, policymakers in order to identify. So when does content cross over from being, within the gamut of what is needed for pluralistic debate, and when does it become immediately harmful? And that's when this idea of definitions and terminology is so important. So what we've done, we've worked with a coalition called the CAD Coalition, Climate Action Against Disinformation, and that coalition is made up of academics, climate experts, disinformation experts, and we've worked with them to create a universal definition of climate disinformation that actually covers everything from, kind of scientific consensus through to cherry picking, through to things like false solutions. And we believe that actually these kind of definitions that are peer reviewed, that are really, really well, kind of understood and researched, are actually super key. Because, for example, if we're all working off a different definition of what a particular type of kind of disinformation looks like, then there's not a level playing field. And, kind of frankly, you could be influenced by commercial interests, political interests. We believe that actually defining what mis and disinformation look across a number of harm topic areas. So, for example, that could be sexual health and reproductive rights. That could be, kind of public health crises is super important. And if those definitions are embedded across policy, across multilateral agreements, for example, then we're all working to a level playing field, and we all understand where those red lines are and where content crosses into harm.
Fantastic, thank you. Lara Levitt, I'm going to come to you now. How big of a challenge is disinformation and misinformation for Meta? And what do you see as your primary role? Obviously, different platforms, it affects it in different ways. What's Meta's primary role in preventing the flow of and promotion of disinformation?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I guess two questions at once. On how important is the problem for Meta, I think the answer is always to say that misinformation and disinformation are both societal problems that exist offline and have repercussions online on our products. And so my answer to that question is usually to say it's similar to the problem that we have offline. It's of a similar scale and similar nature, but we combat it in different ways. In terms of what Meta's responsibility is, and I'll focus specifically on Facebook and Instagram because of their public nature. Our mission depends a little bit on whether we're speaking of disinformation or misinformation. And I'm really grateful to Oreste for doing the definitions work, so I don't have to do it myself. But at a very high level, our responsibility is to guarantee the integrity of our product, the quality of our users' experience, and the safety of our users. And on misinformation and disinformation, that means having the right policies in place and iterating on them and understanding experts' feedback and enforcing them. And these look a little bit different whether you're talking of disinformation or misinformation. On the disinformation side, because the crux of it is an intention to manipulate, and there's this coordination aspect as well, which we observe on platforms, we consider our role to remove these bad actors. And here, the focus on disinformation is really on the actor and the behavior. That means that the problem behind their behavior isn't necessarily what they're saying or the content, but it's who is doing it and how. Often it might be foreign interference, and so the issue is that it's someone from one country trying to affect another, and the coordination or the coordinating of similar messages to manipulate the debate. And here our role is to find it and remove it. And we've gotten better and better at proactively finding this content. We report on it quarterly in a threat report and removing it as quickly as we find it. On misinformation, the balance is a little bit trickier, and Oreste started to point to this where he was talking about harm. So with misinformation, because the focus is on the content and content being false, but not with any specific intention, our responsibility here is to get a very complicated balance right between freedom of expression, or as Oreste mentioned, one's constitutional right to say something that is false, and on the other hand, the integrity of the platform and the quality of the user's experiences and preventing false narratives from spreading. And so we tackle that balance by removing what we describe as harmful misinformation, so misinformation that can directly contribute to harm. And for the rest of the misinformation that is out there, to provide context and to limit its spread. And we do that by working with fact checkers. We have over 80 fact checking partners across the globe and across languages who rate content that is then demoted. And so here our mission is sort of twofold, is to remove the misinformation that is out there that could lead to imminent harm. And Harriet mentioned COVID, which is a really good example where we have a whole list of kinds of misinformation that we remove. For instance, narratives on having to eat certain toxic products to be immune. That would be removed because of the risk of imminent harm. And on the other hand, to provide tools to our users to educate themselves on narratives that would not lead to imminent harm but are still false, and doing that by working with fact checkers. The important thing here that I want to highlight is that across all of this, we also need to be humble about what we can and can't be arbiters of. And we can't become a ministry of truth, or a private American company can't be the ones deciding what's right and what's factually accurate or not. So our role is also to always lean on the actual experts, whether it's fact checkers or civil society organizations and so on.
Okay, thanks, Lara. And you've preempted a question which has come in from the audience, saying, does this run the risk of assigning platforms this arbiter role? So you've answered that. So there is a risk and you don't want to take that risk. That is not your role. I also wanted to come back on your point about disinformation and the actors and people doing it. And I just wanted to bring Harriet in because I understand that there's not a huge amount of people, Harriet, who are providing some of this disinformation, particularly around the climate. Is that correct? Sorry, Luca, can I have Harriet back on, please?
There we go. So yeah, absolutely. So CAN recently contributed to a report from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, which looked at the climate disinformation, misinformation that was kind of proliferating around COP. And that report found that there were only 16 actors responsible for a huge amount of that climate disinformation. And the Centre for Countering Digital Hate found a very, very similar thing when they looked at COVID disinformation. So in fact, it would be, kind of quite, I think, easy and targeted for us to, kind of look at those repeat offenders, because what we have also found is that those offenders aren't necessarily topic specific. So, if you're peddling, kind of climate disinformation, you're also very likely to be spreading hate and misinformation around, kind of women's reproductive rights, and other, and other topics. And so these people are, I think, these are kind of key people that we need to be tackling and looking at. There's also another phenomenon called super spreading that we encounter. So what will happen is these groups have enormous fandoms associated with them. And they will, they will not only amplify, but also adapt each other's narratives to play into some of the concerns of their fandoms. So they are extremely dangerous. And unfortunately, they appear not only as online commentators, but also on broadcast media and in the kind of the online press as well.
Thanks, Harriet. And of course, just to stress as well, this debate is not about Meta and disinformation. We have Meta here to talk about their role, but Harriet also, it's a very similar story for any of the social media platforms, and this pattern of a small number of people creating a huge amount of harm is equally true for a platform like Twitter, etc. Lara, do you want to come back on that point on repeat offenders, because it seems like an important one?
Yeah, it's a really important point, and I'm really glad Harriet brought it up. From a Meta perspective, which is the only one I can comment on, of course, for repeat offenders, we've been iterating on policies over time to figure out how to deal with it best. At the minute, what we do is that when a page or an account repeatedly shares content that is rated as false by a fact checker, then some of their features are limited. So after a certain amount of pieces of content within an amount of time that's fact checked, they can lose their right to monetize content, for instance, to reduce their incentives. We can also add friction to these specific accounts or pages when a user decides to follow them by saying, this page has been fact checked several times. Are you sure you want to continue, or are you sure you want to follow it? So, and of course, their content can be, so pieces of content by pieces of content, a fact check rating will decrease its virality. But if a specific page is repeatedly getting fact checked, its overall content can also be demoted over time. So we try to deal with repeat offenders in this way by trying to decrease the spread of what they are posting, while still maintaining their ability to be able to say it, because of that tricky balance that I was mentioning. So that's how we deal with repeat offenders at the moment. Of course, these policies keep being iterated on as we go.
Okay, thanks, Lara. I'm going to move back to a little bit more of the details of the code, because there's obviously the checking and moderation, which we've just mentioned, but there's something about the way the code was developed. And Oreste, I'd like to bring you back in here. There was a lot of content in the code and a lot of people developing it. It looks like it was developed relatively speedily compared to some processes. So that seems like a big achievement. How was your role as an honest broker key to this? So what was the role? What was the purpose? And how did you carry it out?
It was that a huge, enormous collective effort. So basically, I was surprised to see how seriously all the parts all the parts that were in a way signatories have been taken seriously this commitment, because you know very well that is not always the case. You know very well that sometimes it's also a question of forms and not of substance. In this case, before answering to your question, I should recognize and acknowledge the efforts and the results, but basically, first of all, the efforts of a full-time job of many signatories coming from different backgrounds. Clearly, Lara played a very important role. There were others, colleagues coming from civil society that played the same important role, and the fact-checking community. I mean, and the advertising community. I mean, it would. I don't want to name, but what I can tell you is that there was basically the absolutely awareness that was now or never. I don't know if you get my point. Now or never means basically that it's the last chance.
Yeah.
We have now a great possibility to anticipate as a laboratory what will happen with the SA. We have the possibility to show that what was considered very difficult, so basically to have a consensus, an agreement among different parts with different, sometimes conflicting interests was possible. Clearly, there were some incentives. The first incentive, I think, was the fact that in any case, DSA is at the horizon, is going to come, it's going to be into force. So it was better to, let's say, negotiate being on board than on the other end, I would say, having, in any case, an enforcement from external point of view without having the possibility to even say one word about it. No, this is something banal, but it's a good. I think it's an important incentive for each part. So, having said this, my role was very basic, very simple, banal. So, what I had to do, it was first of all to provide together with first of all with a great colleague Giovanni De Gregorio, and also with a great consultancy that is VVA, Malin Kalberg is her team. What we had to do, it was to provide first of all a draft. I mean, this is very important. This was just a very, very rough and basic draft. Why? Because the exercise of writing the code belongs to the signatories. So we could not, even if we wanted, replace this. So this was for us very, very important. It was just a roadstar. You can call a traveling compass. You can call a point of reference. But then the work was done together in the very long drafting section, 3, 4, sometimes 5 weeks. First of all, in which basically we start from the first word of the first provisions of the first chapter and discussing all together with the comments from the signatories, the comments by the Commission. No? So this was basically the methodology. This was not because what then was very helpful were the working groups. Because even if you would have done each day 3 hours of plenary section, there were always some points that needed to be discussed separately and needed to be discussed by those that were more competent on that area, and especially that conflictual opinion. So what was very important, and this shows also a lot of intellectual honesty, let me say, from all parts, it was to meet offline and to propose to honest broker, to the Commission, a compromising solution. Then it was to be discussed in the plenary section. So this was this was the methodology. And why it's very important, this methodology? Because what we wanted to avoid, it was the lack of transparency. This was the most important, let's say, challenge. Even if took a lot of time, it was very, very important to say, and we can say very proudly, that each word has been discussed. Each word has been negotiated. Each word has been part of an open confrontation. And you know very much that this is quite important in order to avoid internal objection and to legitimize the code externally. This is more or less how we work.
And do you think this is a model that could be used for other digital regulation, this co-regulation working?
Exactly. You took a very interesting point. This, as I said, is the first laboratory. But we have so many other fields. I mean, I think to hate speech, but also to advertising, but also to sometimes European social governance. There are so many fields that would need such methodology. That is not the rhetoric third way between self-regulation and regulation. It might sound like this, but it is just a label. What is important is, again, going beyond the label and showing how this multi-stakeholders approach, that if taken seriously, it's much more precise and tailor-made than hard law. Why? For a simple reason, the legislator might be as competent as he wants, but he will never know exactly how the service works. So there will be some, let's say, asymmetries that then they will fall in the litigation and then in the spillover effects in terms of legal certainty. This is the reason why this model might work for many, many fields. And especially in the light of what you said about the DSA and the shift from code of practice to code of conduct, it's crucial. It's crucial in these cases. But there is also a but, because, it's in any case very important to try to not put on the shoulders of private parties balancing exercise that should be done by public powers. This has happened a lot. You know very well the saga of right to be forgotten. It shows clearly the delegation to a company to the exercise of balancing between privacy and right to be informed. But when we deal with risk mitigation, risk assessment, it's very important, it's very promising, but it should be then assessed in practice. Because my fear is that then the risk mitigation, the risk assessment can basically again shift from public to private a lot of choices that I'm not sure the private company wants to take, because honestly, it's not in their role, in their hands. So this will be very important to assess. It will be very important to start with the good step. Otherwise, the risk is, what I mean. It's a privatization that nobody wants.
Yeah, no, I understand completely. So we have people in the room developing the code who are very serious about it. They're about the substance, and the code gets into some really serious issues. Harriet, I think you would be pleased with the inclusion of the demonetization, because that's something that groups like yours have been talking about for a while. Can you explain? Can you give some more background to that? How this link between the money and harmful disinformation?
Yeah, absolutely. So to understand the scale of the problem, I think we have to kind of go to, we have to look at independent research. And there is some released by ComScore and NewsGuard last year, which suggests that advertising from all of our brands finances, disinformation and extremist content to the sum of $2.6 billion each year. Now, that means that disinformation is a global industry, and there are a lot of people who are making money. And the reason that it is so successful in making money is that it actually works really, really well with the way that our online systems work. So if you think about disinformation, it is very, very unlikely to be boring. It is very unlikely not to, want to get an emotional reaction out of you. Whether it's, whether it's that a famous politician is involved in some really, horrendous events, whether it's a kind of smear or whatever it is, it's designed to be salacious. And of course, what do our online environments, I think, incentivize? Well, it's attention and it's engagement. So these pieces of content are, exactly kind of designed. And I think there was a study by Harvard which suggests that disinformation whips through Twitter 6 times quicker than the truth. So we've got this incredibly kind of viral, salacious information. And of course, what's happening is that it's all got advertising next to it, or it's on platforms that are, whose funding model is through advertising and who want to keep us on the platform longer, essentially so they can serve us more ads. So what you have is this kind of, this symbiotic relationship between advertising and the production of this content. And in order to take it really, really seriously and not, and in order to actually, I think, really, really address the fundamentals, we have to defund that system. We have to break the economic link between disinformation and misinformation and advertising. And until we do that, we are going to continue to create these false incentives or these bad incentives that, that are underpinning the production of and the dissemination of this stuff. And I think the other side of the advertising problem is the fact that actually we produce it as an industry. So, BP, Shell, when they're producing those adverts that say, hey guys, we're super green, or hey, carbon capture and storage is going to save us, that is also produced by our industry. So it is really, really important, in my opinion, that advertising is included in codes like this. And it was fantastic to see it, in this code.
Thanks, Harriet. Lara, inevitably coming to you next. I mean, this has been an argument that's been made about Meta and, of course, other platforms, that you've lacked incentives to stop these information flows because it brings eyeballs, it brings profits. So I'm really interested in your response to that and how you think the code may change that.
Yeah, of course. First, on what our incentive as a platform are, our incentive is the quality of our product. Our incentive is for our users to have an enjoyable, safe experience on whether it be Facebook or Instagram. And we know our users don't want to see misinformation or disinformation. We see it even in the EU with the amount of regulation and the code that are in place. These things are not happening in a vacuum, right? They're happening because consumers raise these concerns that come to legislative bodies that lead to these proposals. The sheer fact that we're on this discussion today is a demonstration of the fact that our users don't want this stuff on our platform, and so neither do we. Our other group of stakeholders, of course, are advertisers, because it's no secret that our business model is based on advertising. Harriet mentioned it quite rightly. Advertisers don't want their ads next to misinformation, even less so disinformation. And so we don't want that stuff on our platform either, because we want advertisers to be happy to put their ads on our products, of course, because it's our business model. I will say that it's not necessarily about the amount of time that users spend on our products. It's more about the relevance of what they see. Just like we don't want someone to be flooded in a bunch of content that's irrelevant, so they have to scroll for hours to find what they care about. We also want ads to be relevant to them so that advertisers find their audience and vice versa, right? So that's the whole point of personalization, is for our product to bring something that's pertinent. So hopefully that gives you a sense of why our incentives are much more aligned with that of our advertisers than we're sometimes perceived to be. Having said that, I say something, then how do I demonstrate it? So put your money where your mouth is, as one might say. And in our case, we do this in different ways, right? So for disinformation, as I mentioned, because an account or a page would be entirely blocked, there's no question of even having to demonetize it anymore. It's off the platform. It can't monetize anymore. For content-based, so for misinformation, if a piece of content has been fact-checked, it can't be monetized. So that's a very direct way of saying, if you're spreading misinformation, then you can't make money off it as a page or account. But then there's also many other ways, right? We can also try to look at where these kinds of content come from. And so we also proactively look for fake accounts, we proactively look for spammers and spamming operations, demote them and remove them. So it's not just about catching the content that's been fact-checked and stopping that from being monetized. It's also about thinking about where that stuff comes from and proactively getting rid of spammers and fake accounts from our platform. The code is definitely asking us to step up, and we're part of it because we want to, and we think this is crucial. And the great thing I think about the demonetizing chapter of the code is that it really involved advertisers via GARM, who represented advertisers. And so it was even just getting to this chapter was a great exercise in getting everybody's interests around the table and figuring out how we can fight this together. Because the bottom line is that, Meta should get better and better at doing this, but everybody else around the table should too. And so whether it's brand safety tool providers or advertisers themselves, we also all need to take our responsibilities. And from my perspective, that's been the code's biggest achievement, is to get all of us to come around the table and acknowledge which part of the problem we can help solve.
Yeah, it's certainly systemic. I think I'm interested, there seems to be something slightly at odds here, because on the one hand, we know consumers don't like seeing, junky stuff and it annoys them. and you said yourself you think consumers don't want it, therefore that's why it's in your interest to not have mis and disinformation. On the other hand, it's being shared like wildfire, so there's a lot of people who must like it in some way. So do we know what that, does anyone want to comment on that? Because that feels like two different points.
I think there's a subtle difference here between people liking it and it appealing to our basest instincts and our, and our biases and our, because we all love to think that we are autonomous, we make our own decisions. But in reality, we are very emotional creatures. We're driven by heuristics and biases. And, it's already been shown that, that some of these algorithms have the capacity to be addictive. We already know that, if we look at, there's been studies done that suggest that, YouTube algorithms have radicalized young men. So I think, to think about it in terms of like and want is possibly the wrong framing. And I think that unfortunately, particularly in times such as COVID, where we've got a global pandemic, people are extremely stressed, they're worried, they are spending a lot of time on the screen. There weren't the checks and balances in place to stop actually this stuff proliferating. And I think it's brilliant that we're starting to have the legislation around it. I think it's brilliant that we're having more informed discussions around this. I think it's great that there are being platform policy updates. What we need is, we need to be super clear. We need to enforce those policies consistently and make sure that there's not passes for, particular groups of people, as there have been in the past. That exempt them from this. I think we've got to make sure that we're really, really, being sure we're fixing the problem. And there's transparency reports and there's all of this stuff from, organizations that sign up to the code and for, the umbrella groups, for example, to show that actually we're starting to fix the problem and that things are changing. And I think this code is such a great start for all of this. I think what's in there is so exciting, I think, from that perspective. And I hope in a year's time we're seeing a complete change, and we're seeing real data and real results on just how this is fixing some of the problems.
Thanks. That's also made me, your point about being in bubbles and things being tailored and thinking that we're all good connoisseurs, that's made me think, gosh, I wonder how much misinformation I've shared and whether people are even aware that that's what they're doing. I just want to mention to everyone who's listening in and watching to please do keep any comments or questions coming in. We've got about 12 minutes left, so we've got plenty of time to take those questions. I've got a question for all of you, really, and this is from my background in consumer organizations and being very familiar with consumers being tasked with doing a lot of the work on this. So, the code talks a lot about developing people's online media literacy, be able to report, being really on the front line of disinformation. Is that realistic, given the scale of it and who's doing it? Is that fair? Yeah, I'll ask Oreste that first.
Thank you. It's we hope that it's realistic. Your point is quite important, and it should not be neglected. But the point is that it was quite ambitious, but important to settle the roots that then should be developed. So in terms of media literacy, for example, it's obvious that it's much more complicated than in the past because not only for the overload, but also because from the consumer protection, there are so many different nuances, in terms of how it's possible to inject some disliteracy, and and it doesn't exist anymore, the average consumer, but it's even more, there are even more, let's say, a multiplication of profiles, of that are not only let's say nuance, but sometimes are topical points related to the difference of preference, the difference of perception, the difference of digesting, the influencing related to family, school context, and then clearly the online world. So it's obvious that there are all those variables that make the things quite complicated. But what we wanted to put there was at least a manifesto that should not be unreachable, should be realistic but ambitious. Say, look, we know that we have this problem. We know that there is this fragmentation, these jeopardizations, even in the consumer protection, but we need to find at least a roadster related to what should be done. And sometimes it's important to have to put the threshold high, because otherwise the risk is that basically you don't get any incentive in trying to improve. And since here we're speaking about incentives also in relation to business model, and as we said, also in relation to external enforcement, I think that it was the right time at the right place to put high the thresholds.
Thank you. That's great, and good that you're being ambitious. Lara, on the point of tools, more generally, how useful are automated tools or things based on AI for detecting things like deepfakes? So how can technology help with the problems of technology, and what makes that successful, and then what also are the limitations?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question, and the answer from my perspective is perhaps a little obvious, in that because of the scale at which we operate and at which the internet frankly operates, automation needs to work as a solution to the problem, hand in hand with human review and human input. And deepfakes are perhaps a bit of an edge case, in the sense that they're a very small subset of the problem, but videos that are edited using AI and machine learning, in order to be detected and identified, need these sorts of tools, right, to recognize them and understand that they've been manipulated. And in our case, we remove videos that are manipulated using machine learning or AI. But stepping back to overall misinformation as well, I think it's a very good example of the way that automation and human review work hand in hand. In our case, we're often asked, well, how do you find misinformation? And I think it's a question we're all trying to answer or solve for. We feed content that we think is likely to be misinformation to fact checkers, and fact checkers make the call. And how do we create that bucket where we use automation and artificial intelligence to do that, using a variety of signals, including user reports, which you mentioned, if a user is flagging something as potentially misinformation, but also the way that people interact with the content, whether comments or showing signs of disbelief, whether it's getting shared in a viral manner. And all of these different indicators are feeding into our AI to then create this bucket of content that might be, or we suspect is likely to be, misinformation. And then the human aspect comes in, and fact checkers are able to determine the content that they want to rate and apply their rating. And in the third step, you might tell me, well, if poor fact checker has to rate content by content alone, then you just told me there's a scale problem that doesn't sound particularly scalable. And that's why AI can come in again, right? And automation can come in again and make sure that if a fact checker has rated a specific piece of content making a specific claim, then we can make sure that gets fanned out to other pieces of content making the identical claim. Okay. So to give you a sense, in April 2020, which is a very small sample, of course, 50 million labels were applied to 15 million pieces of content. And we, of course, did this during the COVID pandemic, April 2020, which is a particularly important moment. And that came out of 7,500 fact check articles, roughly. So you see the role of automation here in making sure that the human work behind a fact check is then leveraged at scale.
Yeah. So there's a high degree of automation, but you're not taking the human out of the loop. And that, to me, that seems really important. I don't think you'd want to be fully automating everything, and then it's difficult to see who's accountable or where things might have gone wrong. Okay, I'm going to move to some closing questions now, because we're coming towards the end, and there's so much more that we could have talked about with this. I suppose, Harriet, to you, you've worked with the UN and the COP26, so you're very much thinking about disinformation and misinformation at a global scale. So how can what the EU is doing with this code link in with international efforts? What would need to happen?
So I think it's brilliant that the EU is leading the way on this, and it's absolutely 100% needed. And you're right, globally, this is such a massive problem. We have misinformation, disinformation in different languages, and that's kind of dealt with in different ways. So I think actually what we need is some kind of global agreement around dis and misinformation. We've done it on things like climate change. We need something that operates at a multilateral level and has that backing. And I think because this is such a serious issue and we see these serious consequences, I think that is, I think that's justified. So I would like to see, this not only leading the way and other countries, and regions picking this up and adding this to the legislation, but I do feel like we need something on top of that as well to fix the problem in a global sense.
Thanks, Harriet. Lara, I'm going to come to you next. How could the code have been more ambitious? What would you like to see next in another iteration?
I think the code was incredibly ambitious, and I would be lying if I said it didn't take me a bit of time to think about what else could we have possibly done. I think getting the right stakeholders in the room needs to continue to be our focus. The code has a small section on messaging services, for instance, which WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger have signed on to. I would love to see more messaging service providers coming around the room because this is extremely complicated, particularly in the context of encryption. But we can't shy away from it entirely either because of encryption. We need to figure out the way to balance the two, which hopefully is what the code does. We've also brought advertisers in the room, and I wonder whether the next step is publishers. They're often critical of these initiatives on the platform side, and that's particularly legitimate because they have a lot of experience. Maybe next time they can be around the table to share their insight with us directly.
Thanks, Lara. So Oreste, even more stakeholders for you to bring together next time. What do you see as the next challenges?
Look, first of all, what said Lara, I totally subscribe. It would be great to have publishers because I understand that they might have different opinions, but there were many different voices in this forum. So I'm sure that in a way it will be possible to add further different voices to find for the next code. I don't think there will be very soon but for the implementation of the code, there is march to include other voices. This would be very important, because one thing is to work from the internal one. Another thing is to, let's say, be on the external side and be in a way sometimes polemics. I understand the point, but if you are inside, then it's possible to have also a different attitude. But this is something that Lara explained already very well. In terms of next steps, as I said at the beginning, this is a starting point. It's not rhetoric, it's really a starting point because it's a very important basics. And I try to, we will have even more possibility, I hope, to show which are the added values that are really, really a lot. But now it's the season of implementation. Now is the season of see how effective have been the commitment. There is a task force that is done exactly for this. It's a work in progress. So it's not it's not a static dimension in which there is the code and goodbye. Not at all. This is, I think, it's one of the most important injections of dynamism in this exercise. The same day in which has been presented to the Commission the code, the same day in the afternoon, there was already the first meeting of the task force. And this is, I think, it's not just symbolic size, but it's a substantial size. And this, I hope, will continue in terms of continuity. And this is the first thing. The second is the transparency center, and to make the things accessible, to make the things, to involve the public discourse, the public debate. Otherwise, there will be always something that not so many people understand, and not so people will enjoy the tools. Since this is something that is done for all the users, it's very important to share the meanings, the tools, and the transparency access in order really to make effective this exercise. This, I think, it's the real challenge.
Thank you. I'm wondering if we should all meet up same time next year and see how progress has been. All right, I'm going to close now. Thank you so much, all of you. Harriet, Lara, Oreste, you've been fantastic and really clear and precise in your answers. And I feel I've learned a lot, and I hope everybody watching or rewatching has too. So this is the last of our Start Talking webinars for the summer. We're taking a break over August. but we'll be back in the autumn and we'd love all of you to join us. We'll be talking about enforcement and how technology can help in September, and we'll be looking at influencer marketing and culture in October. So we've got a really exciting program coming up in the autumn. But until then, thanks again to my panelists. Thanks everyone for joining, and have a good summer.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Ciao, ciao.